Welcome to Rural Farm Tales. If you enjoy rural stories, like and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Now, my dear friend Peterson will help us come to today's story.
In early 1972, every expert said the same thing. Extension agents, USDA economists, local bankers, forward contract your corn, lock in the price. The logic was not complicated and it was not wrong. Corn prices in the spring of 1972 were running at levels that represented genuine profit opportunity for Iowa grain farmers. Better than the previous several years, better than most of the 1960s. Good enough that selling ahead at the current price made arithmetic sense compared to the risk of holding through harvest and hoping the market stayed strong. Forward contracting was the recommended tool for exactly this situation. Extension agents had been teaching it in farm management meetings across Iowa for years. The USDA had published guidance on its use. Bankers who financed grain operations understood its value as a risk management instrument. The consensus was genuine, and it was grounded in sound reasoning. The reasoning went like this: a farmer who forward contracts at a profitable price has removed the downside price risk from his crop before it is harvested. If prices fall between spring and fall, as they had in several recent years, he has protected himself against that outcome. His cost of production is covered. His operating line can be serviced. His family has income that is not dependent on what happens to the corn market in October. If prices rise between spring and fall, he forgoes the upside. But the cost of that foregone upside is the premium he pays for the certainty he has purchased. Risk management is not free. The forward contract price represents a trade, certainty now in exchange for participation in future price movement, up or down. In April 1972, with prices at profitable levels, the calculus favored contracting. The analysts who recommended it were not guessing or promoting a particular financial product. They were applying a framework that had worked in the direction it was designed to work in multiple previous years. If prices had fallen in the fall of 1972, as they had in 1968 and 1969 and parts of the mid-1960s. Owen Garrett would have been the prudent farmer, and Art Colfax would have been the one wishing he had listened to the extension agent. A farmer named Owen Garrett farmed 560 acres of corn and soybeans in Story County, north of Ames. He was 41 years old, had been farming the ground his father had left him since 1958, and was the kind of farmer who paid attention to what the Extension Office published and what his lender advised. He was not a passive follower. He had his own views on agronomy and equipment and the specific behavior of his ground. But on marketing questions, he generally deferred to the people whose job it was to track prices and analyze markets. In the spring of 1972, those people were telling him to forward contract. His engagement with the extension system was not unusual for farmers in central Iowa in that period. Iowa State's Extension Service had a strong agricultural economics program, and the farm management publications it produced were widely read and generally reliable. When the extension economist told you to forward contract at a profitable price, you had good reason to take the advice seriously. These were not people selling something. They were educators working from the best available data, applying a framework that had been developed over decades of agricultural risk management research. The advice was institutional, credentialed, and consistent across multiple independent sources: Extension, USDA, local lenders. Owen Garrett was not naive to have followed it. He was attentive and informed. I want to note this because there is a version of this story that treats following expert advice as itself a kind of passivity or error. as if the correct lesson is to trust your own instincts over institutional recommendations. That is not the lesson. The lesson is that good advice is advice that reflects the best available information, and the best available information does not always contain the variable that ends up mattering most. Owen Garrett's relationship with his extension agent was an asset. The 1972 outcome was not evidence that the relationship was a liability. It was evidence that even good advisory systems have blind spots for events they cannot see coming. He signed a contract in April 1972 to deliver 25,000 bushels of corn at harvest, the bulk of his expected production, at $1.28 per bushel. That price was not the bottom of the range, and it was not the top. It was a solid price, better than what he had received in several of the previous years, sufficient to cover his costs with a reasonable margin. The elevator he contracted with was the one he had been delivering to for 15 years. The transaction was routine. He went back to his fields with the paperwork filed and the price question settled for the year. Then something unexpected happened. Did everything right, every single thing, signed it, locked it, followed the advice just like he was supposed to. And then something happened clear on the other side of the world that he had no part in, no say in, nothing. And it didn't matter one bit that he did everything right, changed everything anyway. That's the hardest kind of loss right there. In the summer and fall of 1972, the Soviet Union made large and largely unexpected purchases of American grain. The scale of the purchases, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery in press coverage that emerged months later, was not anticipated by the analysts and economists who'd been advising forward contracting in the spring. The Soviets had experienced significant crop failures in 1971 and needed to purchase grain internationally to cover the deficit. The United States Department of Agriculture had information about the scale of the purchases before they became public, but that information had not been incorporated into the market price forecast that extension agents and farm advisors had been working from when they counseled forward contracting in early 1972. The information gap was real, and it was not the fault of the analysts. The Soviet crop failure was a foreign agricultural event. The Soviet purchasing decision was made inside a closed government planning system. The scale of the purchases was negotiated through intermediaries in ways designed to avoid driving up prices before the deals were complete. An Iowa extension agent working from publicly available USDA data in April 1972 had no reliable mechanism for forecasting what Soviet grain procurement policy would be in the fall. The standard analytical tools, historical price patterns, domestic supply and demand projections, normal export forecasts, did not contain the variable that ended up mattering most. The grain purchases drove corn and wheat prices rapidly upward through the fall of 1972 and into 1973. Corn that had been priced at $1.28 per bushel in April 1972 was trading at $2.05 by October harvest and continued rising through the following spring, eventually reaching prices that would have been almost unrecognizable to a farmer planting his crop in early 1972. The price movement was not the result of domestic supply failure. It was the result of a foreign policy and trade event, a large government making large purchases on the international market that landed in commodity prices without warning and without the kind of gradual signal that market analysts could have incorporated into their spring forecasts. Owen Garrett's contract held. He delivered 25,000 bushels at $1.28 per bushel in October 1972. His gross revenue from corn that year was $32,000. His neighbor, a farmer named Art Colfax, who had attended the same extension meeting in the spring and had decided not to forward contract that year, not from any particular insight into Soviet grain purchases, but from a general preference for waiting and a belief that the market would be higher at harvest, sold his corn in October at $2.05 per bushel. On a similar volume, his gross revenue from corn was approximately $51,250. The difference was $19,250 on comparable acreage, comparable yields, comparable farming. Art Colfax did not know about the Soviet purchases in April when he decided not to contract. He made his decision on the same incomplete information Owen had, and he happened to choose the posture, unhedged, exposed to price movement in either direction, that benefited from the specific event that occurred. In a year where prices had fallen as they had in previous years, Art would have wished he had listened to the extension agent. The extension agent's advice was correct for the distribution of outcomes that had been observable in previous years. It was incorrect for the specific outcome that materialized in 1972, which was outside the observable distribution. Owen delivered his grain, took his $32,000, and spent that winter understanding what had happened. He read the coverage of the Soviet purchases when it became public. He traced the mechanism: crop failure, purchasing decision, grain price movement, and recognized it as the event that had materialized the specific risk his contract had created. He was not looking for someone to blame. He was trying to understand the structure of what had happened clearly enough to think about how to respond to it going forward. I want to be careful about how that comparison is framed, because it is easy to construct it as a story about a decision that was wrong versus a decision that was right. That framing is not accurate. Owen Garrett made a decision in April 1972 that was correct by every standard of analysis available to him at that time. The forward contract price was solid. The risk management rationale was sound. The advice he followed was the best advice available from the most informed sources in the agricultural extension system. Art Colfax made a decision that was, in April 1972, less analytically defensible. Waiting on a price that was already good with no particular reason to expect it to improve further was not what the experts were recommending. Art Colfax got a better outcome not because he was a better analyst, but because he happened to be positioned correctly when an external event moved prices in a direction that nobody in the Extension Office or the USDA had forecast. The decision had been correct, based on every piece of available information. But the structure of the contract created a specific vulnerability, not to a bad outcome from a bad decision, but to a good outcome from information that didn't exist yet in April 1972. That part matters more than people realize. He didn't spend all winter being sore at the extension agent or beating himself up. He spent it figuring out what actually went wrong. There's a real difference between them two things. One of them just keeps you stuck. The other one tells you what to do next. Owen understood the mechanism. That's why he could fix the tool instead of just throwing it out. Owen Garrett understood what had happened within weeks of the Soviet purchase news becoming public. He did not have to wait for the price to rise to understand the mechanism. Once the grain sales were reported, the arithmetic was clear. He had locked in a price before a market-moving event that no one in his advisory network had seen coming. His contract was legal, and he honored it without difficulty. He delivered his corn in October as agreed, received the contracted price, and closed out his 1972 marketing year. He did not stop forward contracting after 1972. That is the part of the story that gets less attention than the loss, but it is the more important part. Owen Garrett understood that what had happened in 1972 was not evidence that forward contracting was a flawed strategy. It was evidence that forward contracting, like any risk management tool, reduces some risks and creates exposure to others. The risk it was designed to reduce, the risk of a price decline between spring and harvest, was real and had affected Iowa corn farmers in previous years. The risk it created, the risk of being locked out of a price spike driven by an unexpected external event, was also real. And 1972 happened to be the year when that second risk materialized. In subsequent years, he modified his approach. He forward contracted a portion of his expected production, typically 50 to 60% rather than the bulk of it, and held the remainder for harvest pricing. The partial hedge gave him protection against a significant price decline while preserving some exposure to unexpected price increases. It was a more complex position to manage than a full forward contract, and it required more attention to the market through the growing season. He judged that the additional complexity was worth the reduced vulnerability to the specific kind of event that had occurred in 1972. That adjustment is worth slowing down on. What Owen Garrett did after 1972 was not abandon the tool. He recalibrated it. He had learned something specific from the experience. Not that forward contracting was wrong, but that concentrating his entire production into a single forward price created a particular kind of exposure that his original application of the tool had not fully accounted for. The modification reduced that specific exposure while preserving the core protection the tool was designed to provide. I've seen people respond to a painful year by abandoning whatever they were doing entirely, and I've seen people respond by continuing exactly as before and hoping the painful year was an anomaly. Owen Garrett did neither, and I think the precision of his response, changing what needed changing and keeping what was still right, is the part of this story that deserves the most attention. I've thought about Owen Garrett's response to that year, not the 1972 experience itself, which was painful and clear, but the decision about what to do with it afterward. He could have concluded that forward contracting was too risky and abandoned it. He could have concluded that the 1972 event was an anomaly and returned to full forward contracting as before. He did neither. He incorporated the experience as information about the actual risk profile of the tool he was using and adjusted the tool's application accordingly. That is a more precise response than either of the alternatives, and it required holding the 1972 loss clearly enough to learn from it without overcorrecting. The information that would have told him not to forward contract in April 1972 did not exist in April 1972. The Soviet grain purchases had not been made yet. The crop failures that motivated them were known to Soviet agricultural planners and not to Iowa extension agents. No analysis of publicly available information in the spring of 1972 would have forecast the price movement that followed. Owen Garrett was not working with incomplete analysis. He was working with complete analysis of incomplete information, which is the only kind of analysis available to anyone making decisions before events occur. I think this is the central fact of the story, and the hardest one to hold clearly. It is natural, looking backward, to see the $19,250 gap between Owen's outcome and Art Colfax's, and to search for the decision that explains it. The decision was there. Owen contracted. Art did not. But the causal chain runs through an event, Soviet grain purchases that moved the market in an unprecedented direction that was not foreseeable from the information that existed in April 1972. The decision did not contain the risk that materialized. The risk arrived from outside the decision's information set. That distinction matters because of what it implies for how the experience should be learned from. If Owen Garrett had made a bad decision, if he had contracted at a price that was obviously low or ignored warning signs about the market, then the lesson would be make better decisions. But he made a good decision by every available standard. The lesson is something more uncomfortable. Good decisions made from complete available information can still produce painful outcomes when the world contains variables that the available information does not include. That is not a reason to stop making good decisions. It is a reason to understand what good decisions actually protect you from and what they do not. His neighbors who had not hedged sold at far higher prices. He simply honored the agreement he had made. He had followed the best advice available. The market had simply chosen a different direction.